Welcome everyone. Welcome back to another painting session with me. Today we'll be looking at the lands of the Empire. Now we've visited the orcs, we've visited the undead, we've even dabbled with, some of the chaos gods, but today we'll be looking at the land of faith, steel and gunpowder. The old world's most powerful single faction under the rule of Emperor Karl Franz. The empire is a huge, sprawling land, and it's kind of beset on all sides by enemies, but it manages to hold strong, holding on to its ideals. Now, it's not quite a theocracy. The empire is, religion is extremely important to the empire of man, but at the end of the day, it remains, under the rule of a non-theocratic leadership, although every so often it tends to want to slip back under the rule of faith and steel. It's just the nature of what it's like to be in the old world, where you're under threat from without and within by all sorts of evil powers. It's natural to want to lean towards religion. And so in that sense, the worship of the warrior god Sigma, the deified human barbarian from the old times who managed to forge the first alliance with the dwarves, is all over the empire. Not so where we are going today, though. Today we are going to be exploring the province of Middenland, and specifically the city of Middenheim, which is its greatest city within that region. Now, somebody had a sense of humor when they named Middenheim, because a midden, as probably most of you know, a midden is a trash heap or a place of refuse collection. So somebody was having a bit of a laugh when he named it Middenland or Middenheim, but there you go. So Middenland and Middenheim, of course, its greatest city, they are under the sway of the wolf god Ulrich. So the patron god of Middenland and Middenheim isn't actually the warrior god Sigma at all, but it's Ulrich, the god of wolves and winter. Now, there's one other province in the empire, which is Talabeclan, where where the worship essentially of Sigma is secondary to that of another god. In this case, Talabeclan does tend to worship Tal, another god within the empire pantheon, but this is a relatively rare thing. Most of the provinces actually worship Sigma, and that's basically where you would see, Sigmarite inquisitors and witch hunters travel the land, rousing the local population to fight off any number of enemies, from the undead to beastmen to marauding hordes of orcs and goblins and so on. But Middenheim and Middenland are a bit special. They have the Auriksburg, which is the High Temple of Ulrich, and that's within Middenheim itself, the city of the White Wolf, as it's also called. And this is kind of the greatest refuge of worshippers of, Ulrich, the god of wolves and winter, as I mentioned. So it's an interesting place. It's an uncompromising place, unlike Sigma, who basically rose to power by forging alliances. Although he did create alliances through the strength of his arm. I think he's a little bit more of a god of compromise as well as leadership. While Ulrich is old school, right? Ulrich is all about wolves and winter. It's about survival amidst the harshest conditions. And in that sense, there is some kinship with them, between them and the north as well as the Kislevites. So the Kislevites worship bears, right? That's their god Ursun, and Ursun in some stories has too much of more than a passing resemblance, I suppose. He bears almost too much of a resemblance to Ulrich, so they might just be two sides of the same coin. Both, spirits of winter as well as forbidding personality, and extremely powerful in combat, yet staunch allies and extremely loyal. Now, Middenheim and Middenland, of course, under the rule of Elector Count Boris Todbringer, or if you're a fan of the Yorks cast, and Tom and Ben in particular, you would know him as Toddy! Fucking Toddy, exactly. Toddy is quite the character, and ever since, Total War Warhammer came out, Toddy has been a thorn in the side of anyone attempting to play the Empire faction because Toddy has designs on the Imperial throne. In fact, there is a world, I suppose, where Toddy very nearly became the Emperor, but he abdicated for the sake of unity within the Empire because it was a time of great strife within the Empire, and Toddy decided to let Karl Franz do his thing. In that sense, Karl Franz is a little bit more of a complete leader, right? He's an effective warrior in the battlefield, he's a strategist, and he's got, unlike Toddy, he's got a little bit of diplomacy, which is really useful when it comes to forging alliances with elves and dwarves and their kind. So, in that sense, probably it was a good choice for Toddy to not go after the crown so hard. He is second running in the running for the Imperial throne, though, so there is always that interesting sense of danger when you talk about Middenheim. You never know when they'll actually make a bid for leadership of the Empire. And, to be honest, they are the next most powerful behind Altdorf and with its capital, Rieklen, right? So there's always the danger that that might happen. Traditionally, the Empire's emperor is the Prince of Altdorf, but who knows when that might change, especially with Middenheim in the ascendant. And this particular chap, I imagine, is one of the many noble houses of Middenheim. Middenheim probably because Middenland as a province is bleak and uncompromising. Its people are tough, and resilient, but it's not a particularly, I guess, cultured place. But when you get to Middenheim itself, that's when you get to see a little bit more nobility. This is a really interesting model that I'm working on now. He's an Empire captain, sculpted by Alan and Michael Perry. They are both credited in the production of this range. But this guy in particular, I have suspicions that he dates to earlier Renaissance ranges done by Alan and Michael Perry, just because he's a little bit on the dinky side, a little bit on the short side, and he's missing all the characteristic feathers and so on that typically you see on Empire characters, even from Empire people as dour as the Middenheimers. Usually you will see at least a few feathers here and there to denote their rank, and that little bit of flamboyance that makes the Empire so much fun to paint and to collect. But this guy, yeah, he seems pretty mild. So I would imagine that this chap probably came from one of the Civil War, or, well, not Civil War, one of the Renaissance ranges previously done by the Perrys, and then he gets co-opted into the Warhammer range because he's a fairly good fit. And to be perfectly honest, at the time, the Empire range didn't really have many characters, captains basically, who were armed with unique weapons. So like this guy, he's armed with a great weapon, right? A two-handed sword. And it's fairly rare to actually have these miniatures. Most of the characters, I think, were armed with they were either on horseback and therefore armed with a lance and a shield and so on. But it's fairly rare to see an Empire captain armed with a two-handed weapon. Although, as you can see, this model looks really good with it. The other thing that makes me think that this guy might not be originally from the Warhammer range is the fact that his gear seems quite accurate. Insofar as, yes, it's certainly flamboyant, right? As a lot of the Empire stuff is born to be. But at the same time, that flamberge, right? That flame sword, that flame bladed sword, it's a pretty unusual choice for the Empire, and you don't really see it much. So it feels like he's from another range originally. Likewise, his helmet, he's got actually quite an accurate, like, bassinet pig face helmet, which really does remind me of Renaissance period, probably Germany, somewhere towards Central Europe. But yeah, who knows? Either way, he's a really impressive model, and I really like him quite a bit. So this guy is interesting because above the upper half of his body, he's pretty flamboyant, right? Like, I mean, he's probably got the whole dour Middenheimer mentality, but he is actually dressed quite fashionably. And I think we want to lean into that a little bit. So he's probably a well-heeled gentleman from a well-to-do family within Middenheim. With that in mind, I think the idea is to add a little bit more color and a little bit more personality to his outfit. So we're going to go for the blue and white, but I think I want to introduce a decent amount of red to make him a little bit more eye-catching on the battlefield. I also want to add some gold details to his helmet and gear, just to help him stand out a little bit more. So we're going to switch over from Thalasar blue, which was what I was doing the clothing in, or at least half of the clothing, to silver, and then we'll come back in and we'll cut back into that Thalasar blue with our usual red mix. And that's going to help us make sure that everything is nice and neat and sharp, and also give us time to allow the silver to dry fully. I intend to pick up some of these details on his helmet as well as on his greatsword, perhaps even the whole greatsword blade. That might be an option. In gold, because I think this guy does need a little bit more help to stand out on the battlefield. He's not the tallest chap as well. His stature-wise, he's a little bit on the smaller side, although his flamboyant outfit certainly does help him stand out a little bit more. So maybe a little bit more, I don't know, perhaps a little bit more gold to augment his color scheme might be a good one, just to reflect his status and his importance among his peers. Yeah. So Middenheim is my favorite faction within the Empire. There are a lot of people who really like, for example, like the Sterlanders, who are always endlessly locked in combat with the undead. There are people who really are into Wissenland, and it's mostly because of Nuln, its greatest city. That's where you've got the artillery colleges, and that I can sort of make a case for that. Then that sort of black and yellow color scheme is very fetching, I have to say. But there's something really special about how Middenheim is really powerful, yet really dubious sometimes with its allegiances. And it's the perfect mix of. It perfectly represents the fact that the Empire is a loosely cobbled together group of states, many of which are sometimes in open revolt or almost in a constant state of near warfare, simply because of the sheer number of enemies that are surround them. For example, Ostermark is bursting with beastmen and orcs and goblins because of the sheer amount of forests around them. They're also relatively close to. There are parts of the empire which are relatively close to the Norskans. So Nordland, for example, in the north, that northern province, they have lots of encounters with the Norskan raiders. So the empire, for the most part, is beset on all sides by enemies. So it's not surprising that sometimes people question the leadership at the apex of the empire. If Karl Franz were to make even a single mistake, you can bet Boris Todbringer will be on his tail, and maybe one day Toddy will be emperor after all. Yeah. So Toddy's most famous for having had a bit of a dance with that beastman character Kasrak the One Eye. Boris has lost his one eye as well. So that's kind of a 1-1 draw between Kasrak and Boris. Kind of an ongoing feud that adds a little bit of character to that matchup as well, which I really enjoy, because for the most part the Empire is defined not just by its strength of arms, but also quite nicely by its former battles and victories, as well as losses against various foes. So it's almost defined by the enemies that it's fought, and in that sense, the Empire has fought the best and the worst of them. Practically every faction has been at war with the Empire at some point, and that tells you a lot about how big and influential the Empire is. Really quite cool. So we're going to jump in and start to define some areas in red. There are little bits that we will be coming back to the blue to touch up, but we'll worry about that in a little while. I think for now, let's try to block in the main areas of color. I want to leave red and white as the primary look. So instead of going, red on this half, I've decided to maybe just add a line of red down this side, and then we'll shade down that white area with a little bit of. We'll shade down the white area with a little bit of probably thinned What do I usually use? Gryph Charger Grey, I think, might be a good one because it's enough to give it a little bit of definition, yet keep it within the blue spectrum. So that should be a good look. So just a thin red line on the margins of his outfit. And probably solid red for that sash that he's got going across his body. Red is a significant part of their uniform, although the majority of the outfit should still be red and white. Sure, it should be blue and white because that's the colors of Middenheim generally. Yeah. So generally, because well, when it comes down to color schemes, I think Middenheim has quite a bit of variation. Generally speaking, they're always red and white, blue and white. Sorry. But what happens is that whenever they're depicted in various source books, the amount of red tends to increase or decrease as the case may be. I mean, when it gets to the famed Knights of the White Wolf, right, which is basically that particular knightly order that is formed almost entirely from like Auric supporters within Middenheim. Although they do have various chapter houses throughout like the empire, their seat is in the city of the White Wolf, Middenheim. So the rest are to be considered just secondary chapter houses, I suppose, where while the main temple would be in Middenheim proper. Their color scheme tends to be blue, tends to be red, right? Which is kind of breaking from that color scheme. But I guess when you're an important knightly order, I guess you might as well be different. You might as well, take your flamboyance a step further. And that red has some symbolism to it anyway, because it represents the sacrifice that the order has had to make over many, many wars. And boy, has Middenheim seen a whole bunch of wars. I mean, there's a reason why you worship Auric, god of wolves and winter, because you're used to privation of various kinds. And he's a warlike god. He's not one to suffer fools lightly. Very cool stuff. So that idea of a northern culture, tough and resourceful, yet loyal to their friends, and ultimately dependable in a fight, really gives that personality to Middenheim and Middenland. And therefore, every time I painted an Empire army, to be fair, the only other Empire army I've painted is for War Master, but yeah, that's a Middenheim army. The colors are very, very distinctive. Middenheim, for the most part, has a little bit more white to it, it would seem, whereas Middenland tends to be more solid blue. But, practically they're not that different. So, I like the idea that he's got a flamboyant outfit on the top, but when it comes to his leather gear, I think I would like him to be a little bit more practical. So with that in mind, I'm going to do his under leggings in Gorgrunter fur, representing that they're made of hardened leather. So this guy, even though he's dressed, like a bit of a dandy, he is well dressed, but he has a little bit of stoicism below it. He's a practical man at his core, and he's not one to shy away from a fight. And I really like that kind of dichotomy in a model like this. He's clearly one of the nobility, he's clearly well heeled, but he knows how to hold his own in a fight when he needs to. That kind of sums up what I see in Middenheim nobility, as opposed to the peasantry, who tend to be a little bit coarser, a little bit rougher on the edges, but really good in a fight. You do get to see more of what the regular peasantry looks like when you look at Mordheim, because there is a Middenheim warband. Middenheimer champions are a serious lot. Good in a fight and good at drinking. The entire warband champions get +1 strength, making them really, really reliable in a fight, really hard hitting. But they're no more disciplined than anybody else. So I guess they're good so long as they are winning. But insofar as their strength is concerned, they've got a bit of an edge there, and they're kind of cool for that reason. As for the rest of his shoes, as well as for his belt, the harder leather bits, I think I'm going to go for Nazdreg yellow, which is my choice of a more neutral, well, not neutral, but a more yellowish leather, just to have that bit of variation with his under leggings. Yeah, there we go. So I think that looks pretty good. Just this combination of leather colors. It's only in extreme times that I actually resort to using a bit of snakebite leather. Between these two colors, I feel like I've got all the brown I need. Gorgrunter fur for the reddish side, and Nazdreg yellow for, well, yellowish leather. There we go. More of a tan leather color. So yeah, I like the idea that this guy knows how to hold his own in a fight. He's not just, a dandy dressed like a clown. I like the idea that this guy has earned his chops. And his choice of weapon is certainly impressive, right? Like, flambergers are scary stuff. In this edition of Warhammer, and as well as most editions of Warhammer to come, I think they've kind of done great swords dirty, insofar as they've been treated as heavy, blunt instruments. So when you're armed with a great sword, a warrior strikes at +2 strength, which is great, So it almost doubles your average infantryman strength to 5. That's pretty good, particularly when cutting open armor, as well as for damaging tougher enemies like trolls. With trolls being like toughness like 4, you actually wound them on a 3+ now. So that's really good to have a great sword. The downside is that you have to strike last, which means you're striking after the troll. And that's not ideal because you could well be killed before you actually get to swing your weapon at all. So this is a bit of a disservice in my opinion, because anybody who does HEMA will tell you that great swords are actually pretty effective weapons at striking quickly. They've got a hell of a lot of reach, and they have a decent amount of defense as well, because you can easily describe a dangerous arc around your head. Especially when you're fighting like multiple opponents, you can defend yourself with your reach of your weapon, and you can make quite a mess of anybody coming your way. It's going to be a very brave or foolish person who dares to come near a person with a great sword, and unfortunately, the rules of this edition don't really reflect that. But what do you do, right? Like, I mean, you can't always have how you want it. You can't ever always have things the way you want it. Such is life. All right, cool. So the white is in there, the red is in there. A bit of touch up required here and there, especially on that red pinstripe. And I think I've got the leather bits more or less where I like them. So I think the next step is to start to shade in some of the metals. Probably let's begin with Nuln Oil, which is my usual go-to. As mentioned many times in the past, this is the old formula. So to get back to this old formula, you just need to take the new stuff, add a little bit of Black Legion, and you should have something that's fairly close to how it used to be. Just staining enough to add a little bit of interest and recess shading to silver areas really effectively, while not actually darkening it too much. Just enough to take the edge off a lot of the metal colors. So the metal color today, of course, I'm using is Vallejo Model Air Silver, which is great stuff. It's really bright, but a little bit bright without Nuln Oil to sort of take the edge of it. Yeah. So this chap, interesting model as he is, has quite a bit going on. So I think he kind of deserves a little bit more attention to try to get him up to the point where he will stand out from a unit of troops, which for the most part I think might be dressed a little bit more flamboyantly than him. But I think he makes up for it with, a verve, because look at him shaking his fist in the air, daring the enemy to come his way. Bring it on, he says. Such an impressive pose. And the fact that he's slightly shorter of stature as well makes this just a little bit more impressive, in my opinion. So he's got a pair of armored gloves. From how puffy his outfit is, I assume he's wearing, like, everything is heavily quilted, right? So essentially he's wearing cloth armor of some kind. Probably just a gambeson underneath, and lots of padding. Don't think he has chainmail underneath it. Most Empire characters of this, well, of later eras, in Middle Hammer, typically you would see Empire characters dressed in full plate. For the lineage of this miniature, though, the version of the rules that was in play at this time, the Empire did not yet get their full plate armor, so no 4+ armor save. This guy would have been wearing heavy armor and more than likely suffering -1 to his movement as a result. Yes, this is that edition. Before they realized that movement 3 made games extremely slow because the armies took forever to close with each other and were at the mercy of, artillery the entire time. Not a great place to be for heavy infantry. And yet this guy strides along, all confident like, trying to do his best for the Empire. So I've deliberately not washed down the blade of the Flamberge because I kind of want to do it the way I saw it as a kid in a White Dwarf magazine. In that For that particular version of this model, that sword was done in gold, and I kind of like that look. I think it gives him a little bit more personality and kind of makes up for the fact that he doesn't have like a flamboyant feather on his head. And I think that gold coupled with the coupled with the red and the blue really makes him pretty eye-catching. Maybe enough, more than enough to make up for his relatively short stature. Yeah. So this guy would typically be placed in the front rank of a unit of halberdiers. I think that was the most common place for Empire captains on foot to be. Typically, Empire captains, many of them were on Pegasi because that was the most useful mount, relatively affordable, capable of doing a bit of damage and really good for hunting enemy war machines. This guy, however, he's walking shoulder to shoulder with the line infantry. Just a real man's man in that sense. And in that sense, carrying a great weapon, not a bad choice. Lets him deal out a little bit more damage, hopefully keeping more of his halberdier buddies alive so that they get to swing their weapons when it's their turn to strike. So his actions would help his friends, realize their potential in combat. So not a bad choice, actually. Kind of a cool idea. So yes, his sword is going to be very gold, but I'm going to come back in and redefine the highlights a little bit with a bit more silver. So don't be worried. It's not going to be too gold, I feel. Looking pretty good. A little bit more gold on the back. Yeah. So another thing I want to do is pick up some of the details on his helmet as well, just to make sure that you know that it's a bassinet helm or somebody who has a little bit of money to burn on probably really good equipment. More than likely, this was made in Tilia because it's a little bit of the style that you often see in Dogs of War miniatures. So Dogs of War miniatures tend to be more firmly grounded in the looks of Renaissance troopers. So their helmets and armor tend to have a lot more realistic real world detail and tend to look very well made as a result. So this guy wouldn't be out of place in the Dogs of War army, except for the fact that he's clearly wearing the colors of Middenheim, and he's clearly proud of it. So a little bit of touch up of the whites is in order. For this, I'm going to jump straight into some Vallejo cold white. I might or might not shade down the white areas depending on how I feel after this highlight goes down. So first of all, cleaning up the extremities of that stripe, making sure that it's nice, sharp, and readable. And then concentrating this on the raised lines of his tunic. I think he looks pretty good actually. We'll see. We'll see if extra shading. I mean, look, I'm sure it will help. Will it help enough to justify making a difference to his outfit? Probably not. But we'll see. We'll keep that in our back pocket. Yeah. Personality wise, I think Middenheim adds a lot to the character of the Empire. I feel like for the most part, the men of Altdorf are capable and effective. But there's something about the real steel of Middenheim that adds a lot of grit to the personality of the Empire. Middenheim units are hard fighting. They're not indisciplined because they are still extremely loyal to their commanders and highly effective in combat as a result. But they have a little bit of that wildness in them that I think adds a lot of personality to an Empire army. And certainly, this is embodied in the old Knights of the White Wolf, right? They're so like original and cool looking, with their cavalry hammers and facial hair like bursting out of their armored suits. So yeah, definitely one of those units that's iconic to the Warhammer, to that particular Warhammer army of the Empire. Okay, so one thing I do really enjoy painting Empire troops is one of the reasons why I enjoy it anyway, is because there's a real asymmetry that you can achieve with their miniatures. That asymmetry makes them visually interesting and distinctive. Also, it makes it very clear when they are in a marching pose, which is really nice because if you do it right and the poses are fairly similar, the unit looks different from one direction as opposed to another, and therefore you can sort of tell the orientation of the unit simply because they tend to dress in halved or quartered clothing, and I think that looks really, really smart and very impressive. Kind of like a real life marching band, right? Like the colors are nice and bright, but not quite in a Bretonnian way. And in my opinion, Bretonians look best as a riot of color. So the Empire actually comes across looking as the more disciplined lot, even though in practice the men of Bretonia are no slouch either, right? Especially in close combat. There is an interesting differentiation in their personalities. The Empire does what it has to do, surviving as mentioned earlier through faith, steel, and gunpowder, the three core tenets of their faction. Whereas Bretonia tends to get by its chivalry, and also generally by its kind of slightly disgraceful treatment of its peasantry, right? Because the early descriptions of Bretonia doesn't really say a lot about the way the Bretonians are treated, how they treat their peasantry. But the later army books, especially around 6th edition, really go into excruciating detail about how debased your average Bretonian peasant is, which I guess adds a lot of flavor to the faction, but kind of makes them seem rather degenerate, which is not great. The Empire seems to be overall a more balanced place to be, and if I were a human living in the Warhammer world, first of all, why would I want to be? It's a terrible place to live. There's enemies everywhere. There are undead popping up from the ground, for goodness sake. But if I have to live somewhere, I will want to live in Middenheim. During the Storm of Chaos campaign, when Archaon basically led the powers of the four Chaos Gods to besiege the lands of men, he was stopped at Middenheim because Middenheim was such a ridiculous place to lay siege to, located as it is on this giant rock promontory, that basically the entire Chaos Army was held fast against it, giving enough time for the allies of the Empire to come to bail them out. And that's a really cool image, right? It's a bit Helm's Deep-ish, but then again, everybody loves a good siege and the last ditch stand before allies arrive and look out for the coming of the on the third day and so on and so forth. Very cool stuff. Blaring of horns, a cavalry charge to relieve the tired like defenders, rescue them from their predicament. Very cool stuff, and really strong, enduring image of fellowship and of renewing bonds of loyalty in times of crisis. Great stuff. Really stirring stuff. And I am inclined to believe that were it not for Middenheim situated the way it was, and defended by particularly stout and determined defenders, maybe the Empire might not have held, because many of the other cities were not quite as defensible as Middenheim was. I guess once they took away that main causeway connecting the castle, to the rest of the lands approaching it, there's not a lot like the Chaos guys could do to get in, other than to try to, I guess, fly across on the backs of their mounted, or for their mounts, to get across on dragons and so on, and scary stuff, which sounds terrible. Don't get me wrong, but what's your average like soldier going to try to do? Basically, try to fight their way across the causeway. It's not great, not a great place to be, especially if the defenders are bristling with halberds and ready for a fight. Okay, so I'm going to jump back in with a bit of silver to sharpen his flamberge. This is a unique weapon, so it really does deserve a little bit more effort to try to make sure that the serrations on the teeth are nice and visible. Also, for working parts or blades, I like to actually make sure that the gold is there, it's visible. A bit of a gold tint, but not too strong. I do still want it to look like it could actually cut someone, and it's more than just a ostentatious Christmas ornament. So a bit more silver does a lot to try to make it look sharp and dangerous, despite the opulent color. So a bit more silver to highlight his pommel, as well as the quillons on his flamberge. And then what to do now with his armor. So I think it would do well. I would do well to add a little bit more definition to the armor, drawing some more of these silver highlights across the back of his hand, and a little bit where the red has kind of bled into the surface. Likewise for the other hand, I think the danger with a model like this, where there's basically no flesh to speak of, the fear is that the model becomes less readable as a result. Because visually our eyes are typically drawn to the faces and hands of miniatures, because those tend to be flesh colored and very consistent. But this guy, I mean, you could say it's pretty unwise to actually go into combat with your helmet visor down, but let's assume that he's already in amongst the enemy and already hacking away, and he's just taking a moment to cheer his soldiers on, to guide them towards greater heights of violence. Quite the inspirational leader, and a really great pose actually. Certainly unique looking amongst the disciplined ranks of the Empire. Very cool looking. So a bit more silver to sort of define the shapes a little bit more. His bassinet helm actually comes in multiple parts, which is quite interesting. Now, I completely trust Alan and Michael Perry to have done their homework to get this helmet the way it is. So I'm just gonna trust to that and just make sure that the details are nice and readable from afar. Yeah, he's even got the bevel part of his helmet. He doesn't have a gorget though, which is interesting. I would have imagined that protecting your neck might be a good idea. But maybe he's not fighting, maybe he's not fighting vampires today. Gorgets are a lot more commonly seen on the warrior priests of the Empire, specifically the Sigma Rite warrior priests. Mostly because, their witch hunters do like constant battle in places like Sylvania, where you've always got the latent threat of vampirism rearing its ugly head every now and then. Middenheim is actually quite far from that place physically, so maybe not their most common opponent, but definitely beastmen, orcs and goblins, those marauding tribes, tend to make mischief in the lands of the Empire near where Middenheim are. So perhaps that's their more common enemy. Maybe that's why this captain has decided to go for a great weapon to bolster his strength a little bit to help chop through those tough orcs. So I'm going to jump in with a little bit of orange to give that red a little bit more punch. So this is Vallejo Light Orange. Great color, if a little bit weak on pigment. So I might need to mix a little bit more of this than I expect. Yeah, so that's the puddle of the original red contrast paint that I was using. As always, this is my typical mix of Blood Angels Red and Gryphhound Orange for a kind of warmer red tone. And then the highlight goes on pretty smoothly over this. So first of all, his sash of office, which no doubt denotes his importance as a commander within the leader. Maybe it even references his commission as an officer, since he's clearly lacking the giant flamboyant feathers that you typically see on Empire officers. And soldiers as well, actually. And then his sash over here. Just drawing in this edge. And making sure that it's nice and readable. Not the strongest color in the world, unfortunately. It does mean that we need to build it up a little bit more just to make sure that it's visible. But failing that, I might switch to another color to try to achieve the clarity of detail that I'm hoping to get on the edge. Maybe that's okay. Maybe once this is dry, I'll come in with a little bit more red. Looks more orange than red now, so yeah, I might need to do that. So yeah, there are a great many factions and provinces within the Empire to love. All of them have their own unique characteristics and their own unique fighting style and preferences, as well as some differences in the gods that they worship and so on. The Empire is really one of those factions that I feel like in many other settings, the humans come across as a little bit bland and boring. But for the Empire, there's so much to really appreciate. So many little odd little details and rivalries and interesting cities, all of which add a lot of personality to the old world. And we're human, right? So this is by far the most relatable faction, insofar as they're regular humans and they're fighting against extraordinary threats, but they're using weapons that we can readily identify from our own history, or at least the history of Europe. So that's kind of cool. When I first started collecting Warhammer models, I did notice that the Empire looked really unique and interesting. At least to my eyes, I was more used to kind of a more medieval kind of look, like a more nondescript chainmail, swords and shields kind of look to the Empire. Actually seeing them with halberds, cannons, and so on really added quite a lot of personality to that faction. Made the Warhammer world look a lot more interesting, and therefore more worthy of a little bit more scrutiny. So that's kind of a nice little bit of detail. So I'm going to jump in, this time with some Retributor armor from Games Workshop. I'm going to put this primarily on bits of his gauntlets as well as his knuckles. The reason being, applying this over the silver, I think, helps it stand out a little bit better. Also, his visor has a bit of a crest on top, so I imagine he's got a little bit of decorative filigree. on his forehead that helps make his helmet stand out in the crowd. Maybe a little bit on this hand as well, on his knuckles as before. Specifically the joints. This has to be some finely made Tilian handiwork. Tilia is of course the analog for Italy, right? So clearly the Italians in real life made like some of the most, they were the most prolific makers of armor, or close to it, from what I understand. So they had a tendency to create lots and lots of armor which will get sold at exorbitant rates elsewhere. So maybe the Warhammer world is not too different from real life. And maybe Tilia is also doing a roaring trade in armor. Certainly it would suggest so. At least at this stage in Warhammer. Later versions, I think the industry of the Empire becomes quite self-sufficient. And even though there is definitely trade between the Empire and its other human neighbors like Estalia and Tilia, they don't really mention it much in the source books after that. It's primarily the Empire seems self-sufficient. I think I'm going to jump in on the white with a little bit of shading because I think that would help define it a little bit better. So this is a mix of Gryph Charger Grey and Contrast Medium. A little bit of this should go a long way towards establishing a little bit of color on the white areas and make it a bit more readable. So let's drop that into the recess here. Yeah, much better. Around this area that has taken on a bit of the gold, unfortunately, so it's a little bit on the yellowish side, but we'll fix that in a bit. And then just to define the areas between the slit clothing. Aha! So the slit clothing was something that kind of made me a little bit concerned when I was a kid. I think I was always worried about getting it like messy and not doing a good job with doing the larger patches of color. I guess slashed clothing, while it was nice and unique, it really was a little bit daunting to younger painters as well as to inexperienced painters. So it was one of those things that kind of made the Empire a little bit daunting for me at the time. Ooh, this is being strange. That is not great. That is in dire need of cleaning up. So a nice clean brush. Wipe that off. And then come back in with a little bit of white to clean up that area. Should probably be fine. What about you guys? What is your favorite faction of the Empire? Who do you think should be on the Empire throne? Because you've got any number of elector counts, right? Actually, you should have 10 elector counts. Let's not count the Elder of the Moot. I don't think you're ever liable to see a halfling on the throne of the Empire anytime soon, so maybe we can leave that out. But for the other 10 provinces, the main 10 electorate states, I think any one of them might, in some alternate universe, find its way to the apex of the imperial court. But yeah, the main contenders, as mentioned earlier, definitely Middenheim and Altdorf. Well, Middenheim and Rieklen rather. But still kind of cool to imagine what you might have if, for example, the bullmen, the hard bullmen of Talabheim, for example. Of Osland. What if they were in charge? What if they were running things? What would they do? Maybe they would spend a little bit more time dealing with all those beastmen if they were in charge, or even say, Marienburg, for example. What would they be like if the Marienburgers were in charge, the rich burgomeisters of the empire? Right, so I'm going to jump in and do the base, and I think we should be pretty good with this miniature. So grabbing my Agros dunes as usual. Agros dunes. It's over here. Let's drop that in. Let's trigger everyone by applying the paint directly to the base from the bottle. And then run that brown edge around the base edge using my usual dark brown tone. To finish this off for now. So I think I might need to take a hairdryer break, guys. I will come back to this guy and finish off the base edge, as well as to touch up a little bit more on his chest, which I see is still a little bit messy. Okay, guys, in a bit. Hey guys, we are back from our hairdryer break. We've got a little bit of black paint to help clean up some of the areas where the colors ran slightly. And I think we're in a good place with the way he's looking so far. Just a little bit of touch up required, and a little bit of neatening. And I think he should be in a good place. So a bit of a line to separate the blade from the hilt. And a little bit of recess shading to draw the line between some of the colors. A little bit more definition is useful to make the model a lot more readable from afar. And to reinforce the shapes of his equipment. Such a good color scheme. Nice, strong, and readable. A little bit on the primary side, but then that's basically what the Empire is, right? A lot of primary colors, for the most part. I mean, Altdorf is essentially red and white, so it doesn't really stray far. But that, I guess, is a strength because it allows a combined army of the Empire to still have a fairly unified look on the table and still looking good as a result. It's just, I guess, it's the ratio of the colors used. So your Middenheim elements would have a lot more blue to them in theory. Middenheim and Middenland will have a lot more blue, whereas Altdorf would have a little bit of blue every now and then, because there's also the element of colors that are used to differentiate individual regiments, alongside generally the colors of your province. But kind of like Game of Thrones, right, where most of the bannermen had unique colors and their own heraldry and so on. Individual units within the Empire typically also had, their own illustrious history. For example, the Karabakh Greatswords, they might have been from Altdorf, but their uniforms were essentially black and red, mostly because they were commemorating that one battle where they lost almost 3/4 of their number, defending a castle as the last line of defense. They managed to eventually outlast their opponents, but by that time they had essentially secured such a Pyrrhic victory that the rest of the unit adopted that color because it helped hide the blood, so to speak. Oh well, it referenced the blood-soaked uniforms of their peers that had gone down fighting that day, or almost did. So, just a little bit more on the handle of his greatsword. Well, not the handle, but the grip of his greatsword. And I think this guy's looking pretty good, all things considered. Maybe a bit more silver to define the gold on his helmet and on the details on his gloves, his gauntlets rather. And we should be in a good place. A little bit more on his forehead. Again, it's a fine line between painting something that's obviously just a decorative piece and something that's actually supposed to see real service in combat. Sometimes it's a bad idea to take it too far down one extreme, because it needs to look colorful and distinctive and attractive still, yet still needs to look like it could be used aggressively to cave in someone's helmet, for example, in a pinch, so that your soldiers don't look like, a bunch of ineffective fops playing at war rather than actually being effective in it. It's a little bit of a touch up, and I think this guy is just about ready to go. I actually do want to fix that little section. Oops, wrong color. I think I need a bit of white mixed into that, mixed into my Nazdreg yellow to smarten up that pouch, as well as his belt, which has got a bit of blue on it, and maybe to run around the edges of his shoes slightly to clean it up, only because the base color is dangerously close and I don't want him blending into his base, as it were. So perhaps a little bit more. To make it visually a little bit more distinct. Adjusting this on the fly. I don't think it takes too much. Just a little bit to make sure that he doesn't lose his shoes into the mud that he's walking on. Although in real life, it wouldn't be surprising to see people walk into battle wearing shoes that, absolutely caked in mud. Or to at least choose footwear that would hide it better. Nothing worse than stomping around a muddy battlefield in black velvet boots, where everything is visible. I think part of making a model look like he's dressed appropriately for the battlefield rather than for some kind of a gala dinner goes a little way towards establishing some of the world building and respecting the challenges that men like these would face on the battlefield. Rather than focus on ostentatious colors and uniform. That's the underlying bit of realism that helps models look that much more alive, less so like toy soldiers or nutcrackers marching off the war in their regal panoply. A little bit more shading for his blade near the base, just to give that a bit more depth and definition, as well as a little bit around his helmet and his gloves. I think would not go amiss. I'm so happy now that that part, that area around his collar, is no longer stained with the gold wash, which is great news, because it looks a lot neater and cleaner now. Working with washes can sometimes feel like you're fighting capillary action all the time. But the end result, in my opinion, is often well worth it because it layers in colors really effectively and quickly so that you can be efficient with where you spend your time doing things like highlights and shades to enhance the overall look of the model. Plus, it makes the details more readable from an early stage in the painting process, so that really speeds up things. So that when you paint, you're not constantly trying to guess at the details. It does, however, sometimes need a bit of cleaning up, as we are doing now. And there we go. I think I'm a lot happier with the way that looks now. Just a little bit of brown around the base edge, and I think this Empire boy is ready to lead his men into battle gloriously into the breach against some probably orcs and goblins. Let's be honest. I think the Empire has more than its fair share of problems with orcs and goblins. Indeed, that's basically how Sigma ingratiated himself to the High King by rendering his services to him on the spot. Turns out to be one of the best decisions the Empire ever made because in that exchange with the dwarves, they got gunpowder. Yay! And then they go on to make cannons bigger than that of the dwarves. How fair is that? So Empire cannons from the Null Artillery School, they had great cannons which did d6 wounds. D6 wounds per hit, right? Which could drop a dragon, let's be fair, or bring it very, very close to death. Certainly could drop a giant. And the troll was probably going to get blown away if it didn't regenerate. But yeah, the dwarf cannons only did d3 wounds for the most part, unless they were ruined to the nines. So how fair is that? Huh? Who invented gunpowder? I guess you could also say who perfected it, and I guess that would be the Empire. All right, so this is ready to go. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed painting him. There we go. Such a cool guy. All right, guys, have a good one. Cheers. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. As always, like, comment, and subscribe, all the good stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers. Bye bye.